everybody, it's Mena. Welcome back to my channel, or if this is the very first video you're seeing of me, then welcome to my channel. Please do hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't already. I post Monday through Saturday, and today in this video, I'm going to do my top 10 things I find easier in knitting than some people do. So here are some things that I find a lot easier in knitting than some people do. Some people may find this easy as well. Some people may find this difficult. I just find these things personally easy, and like everybody's different. Like if you find knitting the English method is easier than the continental method, which is what I prefer, then that's totally fine. We're all different. So I'm going to be talking about what I prefer, what I find easier and stuff. And if you guys agree with me or disagree with me, that's totally fine. We're all different. Or if you guys have any if you guys agree with me, let me know which ones you agree with. Or if you disagree, let me know which ones you disagree with. So I'm going to get started. So number one on my list had to be knitting continental and purling continental. I find this so much easier. So knitting continental is when you hold the yarn in your left hand. I find this just easier for me because honestly it is much quicker than knitting the English method in my opinion, because the English method I'm not very fast with because I hold my tension super I have a hard time holding the yarn in my right hand and then wrapping the yarn around. I find this much easier because if you didn't see me knit continental or purl continental, which I'll link those videos down below if you wish to see, I use my right hand to catch the yarn when I move it over. So I use my right finger to catch it over when I'm knitting continental and across the needle. So it makes it much easier for me. And I find it super quick too. Number two on my list had to be knitting something small in the round with double pointed needles as opposed to the magic loop method. So to be fairly honest, I actually tried the magic loop method. Sorry. I find the magic loop method a little uncomfortable because I worry about breaking my cord, because a lot of my knitting needles don't have a long enough cord except for my size 13, which is a 32-inch cord, and you usually can use that when you're knitting the magic loop method. So the magic loop method is when you have a small amount of stitches and you put them onto a really long circular needle. So that's how you do it. But if I'm knitting something really small, I know this is kind of tedious and annoying, but I love knitting with double pointed needles because it makes it so much easier when I'm knitting something really small. I know a lot of people love using the magic loop method. I personally tried the magic loop method. I just was worried about breaking my cord the whole time. But then again, we're all different. Number three on my list had to be bind off and knit. Now I hate binding off and purl because I have a hard time controlling my tension when it comes to purling, because like the yarn just gets in the way and it's so incredibly hard to pull the stitch over because you're holding the yarn in your left hand and it's kind of getting in the way of your stitches and binding off. So that's what I don't like about it. But and plus I feel like it gets way too tight in my opinion. But I do bind off and knit because I find my tension's much looser. I don't know, everybody's different because my tension's much looser when I bind off and knit as opposed to binding off and purl. Number four on my list had to be knitting the English method or purling the English method while stranding colors. So knitting the English method and purling the English method while stranding colors is just a lot easier for me because I find my tension's much looser. If I'm knitting continental, okay, so when I'm knitting continental, I kind of pull my yarn a little bit tight, which I have a hard time with. But if I'm knitting the English method, I find my tension's much looser and stuff, and it really helps me strand colors loosely as opposed to bunching them all up, which looks really, really tacky. So when you strand colors, you're supposed to carry the yarn loosely, but because I have a hard time with it doing it in my left hand, I have to do it with my right hand because I find my tension is just much looser because I'm not pulling on it too much. Number 5 on my list would have to be knitting with metal needles. Now, I know a lot of people love using the wood or the plastic needles. I personally don't think they're the best for knitting, just in my opinion, because I think the tips wear down too much. Like, I've tried knitting with wood needles when I first started knitting, wood and plastic needles. I find that the tips for the plastic needles melt down more than they do with the metal needles. Even though the color fades from the metal needles because they're cheap needles, I personally just think that the tips just wear out way too easy for me and stuff. Like, because again, I have tried knitting with wood needles because I heard they're easier to work with because the stitches don't slide off as much. I just think they're way too hard to knit with due to the fact they wear down a lot. Like, I've had wood needles. I think I threw away all my wood needles. All my wood needles just like wore down. All the tips just like completely shaved down, and I found the more that I used them, the more the shaved down the tips got. But if I knit with metal needles, even though the color fades from the tips, I find that the tips don't shave down at all. Number 6 on my list had to be cabling in the front. So I find cabling in the front a little easier because, like, the cable needle's not, even though the cable needle kind of gets in the way, I just think it's easier because, like, it's not as tight in the front as it is in the back. I find cabling in the back a little bit harder, in my opinion, because, like, it gets really tight, but if I'm knitting cabling in the front, it's pretty loose, because cabling does get pretty tight, and it's just much easier because, like, it just helps me a lot and stuff. Even though the cable needle kind of gets in the way when I'm knitting, it just makes it a lot easier for me to cable in the front because then it's much looser. Number 7 on our list would have to be carrying the yarn throughout each row if you're changing colors. So, some people will cut their strings and leave a bunch of tails, which is probably not the best idea because you have more to weave in. I found it easier just to carry the yarn if you're not knitting as many rows, like a certain amount of, like, if you're knitting like a block, and then you need to change a color, then you can cut the yarn. If you're knitting like a 20 to 30 row block, you can cut the yarn. But if you're knitting like only 2 or 4 rows, it's kind of pointless to cut the yarn because, like, then you have more tails to weave in. So the best suggestion, because some people I've noticed if they change colors after like 2 or 3, 4 rows, they'll cut the yarn and stuff, but then you have more tails to weave in. So I like to carry the yarn when I'm knitting only 4 or 2 rows because then it makes it easier, so then I don't have so many tails to weave in. Number 8 on my list would have to be using a big stitch holder if you have so many stitches to hold. So some people I've noticed on YouTube will use really small stitch holders, but that's not enough to hold all your when they have so many stitches. That's probably not the best idea because your stitch holder won't stay closed because it'll be full of stitches because a stitch holder can only hold so many. So basically, if you are knitting, I don't know if they even make these anymore. If I can find it. Here it is. Are knitting and you have so many stitches you got to place on a holder, place it on a big stitch holder because then you don't have you're knitting all bunched up and then your stitch holder can stay closed. And I think it's really weird that I don't understand why people use small stitch holders. Maybe it's because it's the only thing that they have, but it's just your stitches won't stay on if you put like so many stitches on one small stitch holder. If you need to, get a big one because the big ones make it much easier. Number 8 on my list would have to be knitting something small with double pointed needles. Oh, whoops, I put that twice. I mean, knitting a bunch of stitches on a circular needle because sometimes there's times where you have to cast on like 100 and something stitches, and when you 100 and something stitches, and let me get another example. something, 100 and something stitches, like let's say you have to cast on 230 stitches, and these won't always hold like 230 stitches, because a thing like this, like the straight needles, can only hold a certain amount of stitches. I suggest if you are knitting with so many stitches, use a circular needle. Even though you're not knitting in the round, it just accommodates the stitches and makes it much easier, so then your stitches don't slip off. Number 10 on my list would have to be weaving ends and ends with a crochet hook. So for those who don't know, I know I've mentioned this several times, is like, I think because I don't leave long enough tails to weave fully in, I like to use a crochet hook, because it's just, that's the way I was taught when I first learned how to knit, was to use a crochet hook to weave in my ends. Ends, because it made it a lot easier, because I don't cut my ends like enough to sew, because I think that's a huge waste of yarn. Because you're going to have to cut it all off at the end unless you're sewing. So I personally like to leave like a small tail, but not too small, not to so that it comes undone, like just probably like 5 or 6 inches of a tail, and I just use the crochet hook to just weave it in, because it makes it much easier, and plus that's the way I was taught when I first learned how to knit. Okay, so those are my top 10 methods I find easier, and I know some people may find it easier to weave in with the tail, weave in the tail with the tapestry needle, but sometimes you don't always cut your ends long enough to weave in with the tapestry needle. So if you are weaving in with the tapestry needle, cut your ends long enough so then you can weave it in. But if you're not, I suggest probably just use a crochet hook. Okay, so those are my top 10 things I find easier in knitting. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching. Please do like and subscribe if you haven't already. I post Monday through Saturday, and I'll see you in another video soon. Bye!